Hi there, welcome to today's video. I'm Natasha of Natasha Miller Creates. This will be part one of my series looking at stamping in a bullet journal. I'm super excited about today's topic. It's one of my favorite things to do, which is stamping in a bullet journal, but that can be very daunting if you're not sure. There's so many inks and stamps and there's so much information out there that it's hard to decipher through everything and find out what works for you. So today in part one, we're going to be looking at the different kinds of stamp inks and how they work in journals. We'll be testing 4 journals, 80 GSM, 100 GSM, 120 GSM, and 160 GSM. And we're going to take a look at the different ink types and how the different inks work within those pages. So hopefully by the end of this video, you'll have a pretty good idea of what kind of ink, stamp ink, will work best for your journal. For part 2, we're going to be looking at the different kinds of stamps that are out there, namely what they're made of, and the best techniques for using the different kinds of stamp material. For part 3 of the series, we're going to take a look at how you can add color to the different stamp inks and which color medium works best with the different kinds of inks. And then part 4, we're going to take a look at more advanced techniques when it comes to stamping. I hope you enjoyed today's video, and let's get started. I want to preface this by saying there are many different types of ink brands now, but we're going to look primarily at the formulas, and I have a few brands with the formulas that we're going to be looking at. So the primary formulas you're going to find in stamp inks is dye inks, pigment inks, hybrid inks, and then solvent inks. Every brand has their own formula, so even though we're going to go through and see how these different inks work in the different journals, it is important that you test in your own journal, as different inks have different formulas and are going to react differently. But for the most part, the dye ink formula, the pigment ink formula, they all react in a very predictable way, and you're going to see that when we go through the notebooks. Again, we're going to look at an 80 GSM, 100 GSM, 120 GSM, and 160 GSM. And then for an added bonus, I'm going to throw in a 200 GSM notebook from the Sassy Club, and you're going to be able to see how that reacts. If you've been watching my videos, you probably know which one is my favorite, which is this one. And then when we do our swatching, you're going to see why. We're going to start off talking about dye inks. Spoiler alert, I don't use dye inks in my journal. That's why I only have the one dye ink stamp pad. I actually do have a couple others, but I'm going to stick talking about the Memento dye ink. Dye ink pads are water-based ink pads, and they tend to absorb very quickly into the page. Card makers, crafters, scrapbookers in general love dye ink because it's very opaque, the lines are very crisp and clean, but because of how it soaks into the paper, it's not very journal friendly. You're going to get a lot of ghosting and bleed through, especially with the thinner paper pages or notebook pages. So we're gonna look at that closer when we start swatching. With that said, there is a place for dye ink. If you have a dye ink, there are ways that you can work around it. We're going to get to that in a later video, but for now, we're just going to see how the dye inks react in the different paper types. Next up, we're going to talk about our pigment inks. As you can see, I have a variety of pigment inks here. Fun fact, there are actually 3 brands specifically. This is a Tsukaneko. These 3 are by Tsukaneko, and then these 2 are by Ranger. But you're going to see that these all behave wildly different, in the notebook especially. So this is going to prove that it's important you test the ink in your notebook. This one is brand new, but I did run into some ink problems. I don't know if the pad is old or what the deal is, but I did have some inking problems with this one, which you'll see in the video. But so because of the creamy formula of the pigment ink, your lines aren't going to be quite as crisp as the dye ink, but that's okay. You'll see when we do our swatching what the pigment inks are going to look like. If you're using pigment ink, you're just going to want to give it some time to dry instead of just keep going and then accidentally smudge something. With that said, the dry time isn't too bad, and I do a smudge test in the notebooks, which you will see when we do our swatching. The next ink pads you see a lot of on my channel are the Distress inks. This is Distress ink and this is Distress oxide. Now, these two are hybrid formulas, which means it's a hybrid between dye ink and pigment ink. So there's a combination. The formulas are a little bit different. I believe the Distress ink has a bit more dye ink in the formula versus the Distress Oxide has more pigment ink in the formula. You'll see when we do our swatching, Distress ink acts very much like a dye ink, so that's why I think that. The Distress Oxides and the Distress Inks are really fun to build backgrounds with. I don't particularly stamp too often with them. As you can see, the word Distress, you're not going to get clean, crisp images with the Distress Inks just because they are not designed to give you that clean look. They are designed to give you a more rough look. And you're gonna see what the formula looks like in the notebooks when we do our swatching. But these are super fun. If you are going for a rougher look, depending on what your theme is in your journal, this might be perfect for you. Last but not least, we have our solvent ink. Now, you do not want this guy anywhere near your journal, especially if you're working in thinner papers. So basically, this ink, you're going to use it to stamp on any other surface. So wood, ceramic, plastic, acrylic. This guy just stamps on anything. Like, this is actually a super fun stamp pad to use as the lines are very crisp, the color is very opaque, but this is going to bleed through your notebook. So think about alcohol markers and how alcohol markers bleed through your pages. This acts in very much the same way. And also, just a heads up, this will stain your stamps. If that's not a big deal to you, great, carry on. It doesn't mean it's going to transfer the next time you use the stamp if you wanted to use a colored ink, but this will stain your stamps. So just a heads up on that. So without further ado, let's get looking at how these guys work in the different notebooks.
Okay, so for journals, as I mentioned, we have our 80 GSM. This is a Leuchtturm 1917. And this is 80 GSM. I have an Artist Life 100 GSM notebook. This is from Michaels. Then I have a brand new, unopened Leuchtturm 120 GSM. Fun fact, prior to finding Archer and Olive, 120 GSM used to be my preferred paperweight. But now I have obviously embraced the 160 GSM and I am not going back. I have my Archer and Olive 160 GSM. This is a B5 size and this is a notebook that I do swatching and practicing in. Unbeknownst to many is the Sassy Club, which has this 200 GSM notebook, and we're going to see how the different inks work in this notebook as well. And I'll give you a hint very well. So let's get going. We're going to start with the 80 GSM, and we're going to start with the dye ink.
Now, as you can see, I have swatched all of the inks. I have your dye ink, your pigment inks, your hybrids, and your solvent. So if you take a general look, you're going to see the dye ink has a lot crisper lines than a lot of the other inks. The Distress ink comes close and the archival comes close, but I have some theories about the archival. I have researched it and it says, or rather it leans more pigment ink, but I actually think it might be a hybrid as well, just because of how it's reacting and how the images are stamping. So let's start with our dye ink. So this was our Memento Tuxedo Black dye ink. And if we turn the page, you can see there is a lot of ghosting and even a little bit of bleed through the page. So that's because it's water-based and it seeps into the page immediately. Very little smudging, again, because it dries so quickly. Getting into our pigment inks, we have our Brilliance, which, like I said, I ran into some issues with the opaqueness. The Brilliance isn't super opaque to begin with, but this isn't right either. So it's definitely a faulty stamp pad, which is annoying because it's brand new for this video, but So there we have the Brilliance. Here we have the VersaFine, the VersaFine Clear. This is the Ranger Pigment Ink, and then this is the Ranger Archival Ink. Okay, now all of them except for the Ranger Archival smudged, and that's because it sits on the page very wet. The Ranger Pigment Ink smudged a lot. This was a very juicy stamp pad. And so if you're using this guy, you want to be very careful. Again, my favorite out of the batch is VersaFine, but let's look at bleeding and ghosting. So the Clear, which is the VersaFine Clear, bled through, so you want to be careful of that one. And the VersaFine, which is my favorite for my notebook, bled through a little bit as well. So if you're working in a Leuchtturm or an 80 GSM notebook, you're going to want to look at the Brilliance or the Ranger Archival. Those guys performed the best in terms of bleed through. Now, there's still a lot of ghosting because the paper is thinner. An option you have when you're stamping in your 80 GSM is to glue the pages together if it's bothering you. So now we have the hybrid inks. So this is the Distress ink, which I think has more of a dye-based formula. And the lines are a lot crisper, a lot cleaner, very similar to the Memento over here. And then we have the Distress Oxide, which as you can see, it's like blotchy and the color isn't very flat, which that is the nature of the Distress Oxide, which is this guy. The formula is designed to do that. So if we take a look at the back, the Distress Oxide bled through versus the Distress ink just had some ghosting. There's a tiny little bit of bleed through, but not as bad as the Distress Oxide. Down here we have our Solvent ink, which is the one that you don't want to put near your notebook. And again, the stamp pad was very juicy. It got a little bit splotchy over there, but there was a ton of bleed through. So, and it actually transferred over onto this page a little bit. I don't know if you can see those marks there, but that is the bleed through from the Solvent ink. So that is the 80 GSM notebook. For my 100 GSM notebook, I am using the Artist's Loft journal, which I got this from Michaels. I have a review of this journal that I've linked down below if you wanted to go check out and see what it's about. But for today, we are looking specifically at damp inks. So again, we have our dye ink, which is our Memento. There's our Brilliance, which is this guy, VersaFine, Clear, Ranger Pigment, Ranger Archival, and then our hybrids and Solvent. So again, the dye ink, very crisp lines and no smudging. And if we look at the back, there is bleed through and ghosting. So for our Pigment Inks, very little smudging, except for the Ranger Pigment, which is this guy. Like I said, I found this stamp pad to be very juicy and a little bit out of control. So just keep that in mind. If you're using this or if you're hoping to use this, make sure to test it in your notebook first. So if we look at the bleed through and the ghosting, the VersaFine Clay did have a ton of ghosting with a little bit of bleeding. This is the VersaFine, which had ghosting as well. The Ranger Pigment had very little ghosting, which is really cool to see, but you're going to want to let this guy dry for a while. And then of course the Brilliance and the Ranger Archival ink, there is nothing. There's no ghosting, there's no bleed through. So if you're using 100 GSM, you're going to want to try one of these two inks, which again is the Brilliance and the Ranger Archival. Moving on to the Distress ink and the Distress Oxide and the Solvent ink. The Distress Oxide has some ghosting and it looks like it tried to bleed through a little bit. And then this is your Solvent ink. It's just, yeah, don't use it in your notebook. No, use it for other projects, don't use it in your notebook. We are back in a Leuchtturm for the 120 GSM page test. Fun fact, when I first started journaling, the 120 GSM was my favorite. It was a different brand, but I was kind of excited to see the 120 GSMs come back. This one is not white. I don't like the ivory cream pages, so I'm probably not going to go back to this, but I digress. Let's look how the inks perform. Again, the dye ink, very crisp lines, very crisp edges. There is a tiny bit of bleed through and a ton of ghosting. Here we have the Pigment Inks. A little bit of smudging on all of them except for the Archival and the Brilliance. The smudge test was immediate as soon as I stamped, so that's why you're going to see that. So here we have the Clear. The Clear has a ton of ghosting, a little bit of bleed through. Here we have the Ranger Pigment Ink, which is this one. It's not bad. Again, you're going to see ghosting. Same with the VersaFine, which is this one, Pigment Ink for fine details. So if you're in 120 GSM, you're going to want to stick to the Brilliance or the Ranger Archival. This one has a little bit of bleed through too, but the Brilliance you're not seeing at all. So again, those are your two options for the 120 GSM. For our Distress ink, I accidentally stamped the Distress Oxide there, that's why it's scratched out. But here we have our Distress ink and our Distress Oxide, and here we have our solvent. Our Distress Oxide has ghosting, and our solvent has bleed through and ghosting, and then the Distress ink actually did pretty good. That stamp over there is the oxide, of course, that I messed up, but the rest of it's not bad. So if you do have the Distress inks, it is an option for you in the 120 GSM. I know stamp inks are expensive, so if you wanted to make the most of what you had, you know, the Distress inks are fun to decorate with, but then they also start working really well in the 120 GSM notebook. Now we're on to my personal favorite, which is the 160 GSM, and this is Archer and Olive. And this is how they look. So very little smudging for the Clay and the VersaFine. I do speak from experience, it can smudge, so just keep an eye on that. You always want to give your pigment inks just a little bit more time to dry. But let's see how they performed. For the dye ink, there is a tiny bit of ghosting. I don't think the camera is picking it up, but there is a shadow through the page on the dye ink. So if you're using 160, the dye ink might be an option for you, but like I said, there's a tiny little bit of ghosting, and if I'm in a 160 GSM notebook, I want nothing. I want no ghosting, I want no ridging, and I want no bleed through. So just keep that guy in mind. For your pigment inks, honestly, you can go for any of them. The Clay does ghost though, and that's this guy, the Pigment Ink VersaFine Clay. I don't use it. Ghosting is minimal. It's ghosting more than the dye ink, to be honest. So that's up to you if that's going to bother you or not. My favorite for the 160 GSM is the VersaFine, but you also can't go wrong with the Archival or the Brilliance. I like the VersaFine because it is more opaque, it is crisper, it is a darker color. I don't know, this looks more gray, and then of course that was a bust, but I do prefer how opaque and vivid this is, so I do go for a VersaFine in my 160 GSM. Looking at our hybrid inks, this is a better idea of how the Distress Oxide works. As you can see, it looks a little rough, and that is exactly what it's designed to do. So if we take a look at ghosting and bleed through, there is no ghosting and no bleeding from the distressing, and here you see ghosting from the solvent, and there's even threatening to bleed through a little bit. I don't know if the camera is picking that up or not, but it is threatening to bleed through. So yes, solvent ink and a notebook don't get along. there is this little guy from the Sassy Club. I am going to quickly point out this is not a sponsored video. I have done a review of this journal before, which again, I'll link down below. But I thought it would be fun to test these different inks in this journal as well. So the Sassy Club is primarily a stamp company. So when she designed this notebook, she designed it for anything, to use anything in. So let's take a look how everything performed. There was a little bit of smudging on the inks you'd expect. So the Pigment Inks had a bit of smudging, the Distress Oxide had a bit of smudging, and there's a tiny bit of smudging on the dye ink, as I do think this paper might be a little bit coated. Not a lot coated, but a little bit coated. There is no bleed through, no ghosting, nothing. So basically you can use any ink pad you want in this notebook. This is a stamper's dream because, like I said, stampers tend to prefer dye inks versus, I feel like us journalers tend to stick more to the pigment inks. So if we look at our hybrids and our solvents, can you guess what's going to happen? Nothing. No ghosting, no bleed through, nothing. And that's just one page. I didn't skip a page. I didn't glue a page together, but there is nothing there. You can even use the solvent ink in there. So just to touch a little bit more, I don't think I've spoken much about why card makers prefer to use dye inks, and it has to do with how you're adding color to your stamps. Again, we will be talking about this in a later video. Today, we were just looking at simply stamping in your notebook and which is going to be best. Okay, so that's it for stamp inks in your journal. Again, and I can't stress this enough, please test in your own notebook before you just start happily stamping. As you can see, the different stamp pads acted very differently in the different journals. Different journal companies have different paper types, obviously the paper thicknesses, but some are coated, some are not. You're going to want to keep an eye on that. But for the most part, they are predictable in terms of dye ink, pigment ink, hybrids, and solvents. Hybrids, again, maybe a little less predictable than dye inks and pigment inks and solvent inks, but again, just make sure that you're testing. I would have loved to have more of a variety of ink to test for you, but it does get expensive after a while, and these are the brands that I had and that I'm familiar with and that I've tested in my journals. And like I said, for my 160 GSM Archer and Olive, I'm always going to be reaching for my VersaFine. Friends of mine in the community that are in the thicker notebooks as well, they go for the VersaFine as well. So again, the brilliance is going to be perfect if you're in the thinner pages. I wish my ink pad was working better than that. With that said, you're still not going to get as opaque of a color as the VersaFine or the Claire or the Ranger. Knowing from experience, when I first started bullet journaling and stamping in my journal, I was in a Leuchtturm using the Brilliance, and while it was better than this one performed, it wasn't quite as opaque as the others. Yep, just keep that in mind. I hope you found this video helpful. I look forward to the next installment of this series, where we're going to take a look at the different stamp types, and we're going to talk about the different techniques you can use depending on the quality of the stamp. I hope you enjoyed today's video, and I will see you in the next one. To see how I use my stamps in my journal, you can check out one of these two videos. I'll see you over there.